This is Counterpoint. I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. Canada now has recorded more than 76,000 medical assistance in dying, known as MAID, deaths since the legalization in 2016, with over 16,000 deaths in the most recent reporting year alone. That means MAID now accounts for roughly 1 in every 20 deaths in Canada. What began as a narrowly defined end-of-life option has in less than a decade become one of the leading causes of death in our country. Now, a federal parliamentary committee is warning that Canada should pause any expansion of MAID to include cases where mental illness is the underlying condition. The concern is not abstract, it goes really to the heart of medical judgment. Can clinicians reliably distinguish between irremediable issues and treatable suffering, especially in cases marked by instability, disability, or inadequate care supports? Well, tonight on Counterpoint, I'll be speaking with Dr. Ramona Coelho, family physician and former member of the MAID Death Review Committee, about whether the safeguards are strong enough for where the law is heading next, or whether Canada is already moving beyond what it can safely oversee. Dr. Coelho, thank you so much for joining me today. We've had many guests on this issue on MAID, and you're a very distinguished guest, so I really appreciate your time.
Oh, happy to join you. Thank you.
So you've been published in various places, most recently in the National Post, and you argued that the parliamentary committee got it right when it caused for a pause on MAID expansion for mental illness. What do you see as the most important part of their conclusion?
Yeah, so my Globe and Mail opinion piece this week was about their singular conclusion. So they just had one recommendation that Parliament should indefinitely halt MAID for mental illness. And my opinion piece argues that that's a great start, but we must do much more. There are many problems with our current MAID regime, many concerns I have for vulnerable Canadians, and this would be a good start, but just the start of what Parliament needs to do.
Okay, and I'm looking forward to unpacking what some of your recommendations would be and why there are many red flags on the play, not just on mental illness. But let's focus on mental illness for a little bit. In your view, is the mental illness eligibility debate really just a surface issue? You mentioned it speaks to sort of broader issues you have with MAID in general. What specific issues are you trying to highlight in your article?
Sure. So I would start by saying that a lot of people are seeking MAID, in my opinion, for mental health issues, even if they're near the end of life or have disability. It is well known that when people have a new disability or have a setback or find out they have a terminal illness, that they might have a high likelihood of also becoming mentally ill, of becoming depressed, and those things can influence decisions to die. So that already is a concern for me, specifically because mental illness is not irremediable. So if we look at what the Carter decision kind of lay on, this kind of exemption to an absolute prohibition on homicide and assisted suicide, it was based on the idea that a disease was grievous and irremediable, and that a person would experience a severe decline in capability, meaning they wouldn't get better. With mental illness, there may be a few people who will never get better, but we cannot predict who they are. And so if we allow people to die for mental illness, basically when they could be suicidal, because we don't know how to distinguish a reasoned MAID request from suicidality, we will be ending the lives of people who would just statistically would have gotten better, because we know we can't guess right who wouldn't have gotten better. And so that is extremely concerning. So the stopping of this last expansion for mental illness, which is legislated to come into effect March of 2027, this recommendation is really important. I hope the government responds with corresponding legislation, or that Tamara Jansen's bill C-218 passes that will stop MAID for mental illness as a sole issue. But I'm still concerned about mental illness as a driver and psychosocial suffering as a driver of other MAID requests.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting thing to highlight, because you're right. Many of our viewers may have themselves dealt with, a new disability or a new diagnosis, physical diagnosis, and then there's a mental component that comes into play then. So that's a very interesting point to be made. We're going to continue this discussion when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around. Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're discussing the expansion of MAID into mental illness and a recent committee's report saying, stop, do not do this. We're not going to go past this point. So we're going to see how the government will respond. And join me to have that discussion is Dr. Ramona Coelho. Dr. Coelho, in the previous segment, we're discussing whether mental illness can be deemed irremediable and how many cases that could be the case. How often would you suggest that clinicians are confident in the judgment in psychiatric cases that they can be remediated or that they can't be?
Well, there is a group of lobbyists, of MAID lobbyists and Dying with Dignity. Stephanie Green, who was a previous advisor to Dying with Dignity and founding member of CAMAP, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, have said they are ready, they can do this. They have come up with a guidance on how to do it, but it doesn't matter because if the guidance is not based on evidence, if it is a consensus of a very few people and doesn't actually match scientific evidence, then it's not safe. Then there's no real standard. And so what happened at committee is that even though all parliamentarians, it was a proportional pick of experts. So the Senate had a third, the Liberals had about a third, I think the Bloc had 7%. Anyways, the point was that everyone got to pick their experts. Overwhelmingly, the majority of experts were against this expansion because there's just not evidence to do it safely. There's no standard to build that decision-making model.
And are there other jurisdictions in the world that do have euthanasia, do have MAID for mental illness?
Yeah, so the Netherlands, actually, there was one whole panel at AMAD, the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying, that were Dutch psychiatrists. And they were sharing that the high levels of people who access MAID for mental illness, this very troubling group of very young women, a lot of them who are victims of trauma that our society has inflicted on them, for their mental health suffering, that are receiving MAID for mental illness. And 2 out of the 3 psychiatrists were saying, don't do this. This has been like a big mistake for us. We had very low numbers for many years, but then there was a big, I'm not sure if there was an advertisement or documentary, you have to look it up, their testimony, but that led to a social contagion and a dramatic rise in requests. And this is something else about MAID and mental illness and messaging. We do not live in a vacuum, and our choices are highly influenced by, first of all, what care we have access to, but also the messages that we're given.
Right.
And that is one of the primary principles that we know in suicide prevention, is that messages affect choice. So when we tell people, hey, your lives are worth it, stay with me, connect with me, I have hope, I have hope that you'll get better, a person is much more likely to do better, versus if we increase suicidal messaging, like your life probably isn't worth living, actually. I agree that your suffering is never going to get better, and I will provide the lethal means to do it. We know from suicide prevention research that those are the kinds of things that can cause a societal contagion that can increase people's desire to die.
Absolutely. I mean, we see this with youth on social media where they're, suicide groomers, and you know, we abhor that kind of behavior. So leads to my next question. So, like, where do you see the biggest gap between MAID policy as it exists today, as it's written, and how it's actually being applied in real clinical settings? Because, I mean, we all heard about that case outside of a Tim Hortons where apparently someone was offered MAID outside of a Tim Hortons in an Ontario somewhere.
So actually, this is very close to where I work, and I've heard other stories about this provider. In fact, I was one of the cases I did raise to the coroner that's now in the media also. So Thomas Dillon was a 45-year-old man with, he did have inflammatory bowel disease, but he had been living with his disease and had a very supportive family. To my knowledge, became very depressed, started having addictions. And his psychiatrist, instead of offering him therapy, well, he offered him therapy, but he also suggested that he actually qualified for MAID because he had a disability.
Wow.
And he was assessed outside of Tim Hortons once. This is supposed to be, MAID providers are always saying that these complex track 2 cases will have a lot of scrutiny, that the safeguards will hold, that people won't go forward unless they're sure. He was assessed once outside of Tim Hortons.
Wow.
And later, when he had his MAID provision, it was that same provider, James McLean, who drove him to the cadaver storage unit where he ended his life. And it's highly traumatizing for the family. Very, very sad. But this is not the only case.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there. We have to go to commercial break, but hold on to that case. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. I'm joined by Dr. Ramona Coelho, who is a family physician and a former member of the MAID Death Review Committee. And we're discussing the recent decision by Parliament Committee to recommend halting the expansion of MAID to include those who have the sole diagnosis of mental illness, which is interesting because a lot of the talk around medical assistance in dying is about safeguards. Dr. Coelho, let's talk about those safeguards. We highlighted where I would like to say, I'm sure you would agree, that safeguards were not implemented when that gentleman was offered and counseled into MAID outside the Tim Hortons in southwestern Ontario. And that's just one case amongst many. And we always hear about these cases, and good for the media for reporting them, because sometimes I'm surprised they give so much attention. And it's like the whole world is paying attention to what Canada is doing. But speak to me about those safeguards. Like, are they actually being meaningfully applied? Where do you see these safeguards breaking down?
So I think there's two parts of that. And I've written an article with my confreres, Trudeau Lemons, who's a bioethics and legal chair at the University of Toronto, and David Shannon, who's a lawyer from Thunder Bay. We were all former members of the MAID Death Review Committee. We wrote an article in the British Medical Journal of Supportive and Palliative Care called Safeguard Failures in Canada's MAID Regime. But there's two things. One is that the legislation is written in such a broad way that it allows for a vast, I would say, interpretation. So what does, when you said that initially it was narrowly defined, I would argue that even in 2016, what does reasonably foreseeable natural death mean?
Right.
So in other jurisdictions, we have a very clear disease prognosis of 6 months. So your cancer will likely end your life in 6 months. Now, there is always uncertainty in prognostication, but for sure, as we get closer to the end of life, it's more accurate. There was a study that came out by Suicidality Allen. I believe she is the scientific curriculum director of ChemApp. It was published in our Canadian Medical Association journal, looking at variation in assessors and their interpretation of this legislative language. And for example, for a reasonably foreseeable natural death, so what we would consider to be end of life, MAID assessors varied from 6 months or less to 5 years or less.
Oh, wow.
That kind of range is unacceptable, right? So you have some MAID practitioners who are withstanding, I would say, social pressures and practicing more carefully and interpreting that language, I would say, more responsibly than others. And then you have some lax providers, I would say, like James McLean, who really are pushing the limits of the law. And the law is kind of allowing for that because the law doesn't actually have a corrective oversight. For many years, they've been saying, and I'm talking about MAID lobbyists in Parliament, that there are no criminal cases, there have been no college sanctions, that therefore there are no problems. But really, there's two things. The law is written so broadly that it can be interpreted in what I consider to be a very lax way that is not keeping with the spirit of the law. And then there's no one doing very strong oversight. Our Ontario Coroner, of which I was a former member of his MAID Death Review Committee, does review all the cases and does make recommendations and gives lessons to the MAID practitioners. That's very good. But that is not enough. That is not sanctions when someone is doing what is happening, like in the case of Thomas Dillon. And James McLean, for example, the college did not send that case or the case of Brad to a disciplinary tribunal.
But why not?
Yeah, so that's the thing. I think that there's some ideological and some power politics happening here. There's a lot of power and privilege on the side of the MAID lobby groups, not so much from the
Mm.
disability communities, right?
Wow,
And
that's
so
really sad.
I know it breaks my heart actually. And for the
Mm.
families, I know these families. It's very, very sad. This many families across Canada who basically have had their loved ones' lives ended, uh, and they are not comfortable. Like they are totally traumatized by how it happened. And actually, there's emerging research. Just very quickly, because I recognize the time, but there was a University of Alberta study that came out this year in March of 2026 that interviewed families' perspectives of MAID. And some of them didn't know about the MAID death until after it happened. Some of them were concerned that actually not all care had actually been pursued before the person's life was ended. And there was a study at the Joint Center of Bioethics in Toronto, which showed 1/3 of families were um, traumatized by the procedure, and 1/3 were upset that it was driven by unjust means.
Wow. Okay, we're going to continue this very grim discussion when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around. Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're discussing MAID and a recent recommendation from a parliamentary committee to halt the MAID expansion to include those whose sole diagnosis is mental health. And this has caused a lot of waves all around the world. People are really paying attention to what Canada is doing here with MAID, especially with the mental health, with those suffering from mental health diagnosis. So, Dr. Coelho, again, thank you for joining me. You've really been at the forefront doing research and meeting with probably both proponents and opponents of MAID expansion. Uh, it seems to me, after we've covered several shows on this issue, that a lot of attention, quite a bit of resources are thrown, to offering MAID to those who are at some point unforeseeable, whatever, near the end of their life. What about those who want to live? Are we doing enough to support their journey in illness, to support them in their palliative stages, in their respite stages? Because sometimes I get the impression, and again, like I'm not an expert, you do the research. Sometimes I get the impression that we sort of are kind of funneling people by default into picking the MAID option.
I think I've written exactly that's my concern. It is true that the Health Canada reports do not capture enough data for us to know, in the sense that they are self-reported by the MAID provider after the death. And I think that there should be a collection of whether the person had services that they needed to live. On the other hand, we have many cases. We've known from the beginning, the disability community has said the United Nations on the Conventions of Rights of Persons with Disabilities ruled in 2025 that Canada is not meeting the needs of persons with disabilities so that they can thrive, and yet we were offering them MAID, which is actually discrimination and ableism.
Mm.
If you look at the Health Canada reports, what they do show us is that what are the drivers of suffering? And people often think it's like intolerable pain. I think that that's how this legislation was passed. These are for cases, exceptional cases of intolerable pain that we can't help them, and so we're going to help them end their life. If you look at what is driving, often there's like fear of future suffering, fear of decline, fear, loneliness, social isolation, fear of being a burden. I would say none of those things really speak to me about choice, and they speak about coercive influences to die. So even in the Health Canada report, along with these myriad stories that we're hearing, and Dying with Dignity sells this as about compassion and choice.
Mm.
But I would say that a lot of Canadians don't understand. I don't know if you saw in the National Post, Sharon Kirky published an article in June which talked about failed MAID deaths. And when I was talking, the last segment we just ended about 1/3 of the families found the procedure itself traumatic.
Right.
Right? So the procedure is sold as like beautiful and perfect. In fact, we have research that shows from the MAID community that about 1.2% of the time there are complications. And so people will say, well, that's only 1 in
Well, like
100.
like
Well,
what
we're
kind of
talking about
complications are we talking about here?
so adverse events. So one of the stories that Sharon Kirky told was actually one that the coroner released to try to help again, lessons learned to MAID providers, so that they would do proper informed consents. It was a gentleman who had an adverse reaction to the medication, and halfway through the procedure started crying for help. like, help me, and he was groaning and grimacing, signs that he was actually in pain. And we know, for example, the other story about James McLean of Bradley Stewart, that the third med wasn't administered, which I didn't know at the time, but he revived after the doctor said he was dead and left. He started breathing again. The family had to get back the MAID provider to finish the procedure. It was highly traumatic for them. I think part of the decision to choose MAID was that they were told that it would for sure be like a peaceful death as opposed to a natural death, which is what I'm hearing more and more. There are people are being told that palliative care, might not come through, might not be a great death, but MAID will always be a perfect death. Well, that's simply not true. So if people are choosing MAID because of isolation, fear of being a burden, lack of services, and the information that they're receiving about the MAID death is also not fully informed, that's concerning to me.
Absolutely. Dr. Coelho, thank you so much for your insights here. And I personally am very happy to hear that there's been a recommendation to halt the expansion to MAID mental illness. And I worry for those who have mental health diagnosis that they sometimes will choose suicide, be it through MAID or elsewhere, because that's the only option they see. So let's see we'll have to keep our eyes on this story. Thank you so much. Thanks for watching.